and other frameworks have been focusing on preparedness. So we have to change our approaches. Okay, thank you. Then, as we don't have any further questions, we would like to start the second session. We're going to have a 10-minute break and resume it again. Now, okay, so we're going to meet again at 5:30 p.m. Thank you. Have been working so hard. So we have also have to talk about the governance system. Well, and as the head of the center said, now this is the last session. What could be the way forward for sustainable DRR and community resilience? Let's get started. Well, we are quite a lot behind the schedule. 35 minutes late. I guess that we may have to be later and later than 6:30 p.m. Well, but it will be great if you make sure that you finish your talk in 3 minutes. If you that 3 minutes in mind, then you may talk for 5 minutes. Well, let me, without further ado, let me get into the discussion right away. Well, we've been talking on the assessment of the international effort, and followed by these comprehensive disaster, the combined disasters. What kind of impact were made on our life and society, and what kind of lessons we have to learn from them will be also discussed. And then the third question is how we can mitigate the risk of disaster and how we can make ourselves be resilient and strong to this disaster. And to make that happen, how we have to be prepared. And last but not least, maybe we're going to do make some free discussions. And what we have to pursue after the COVID-19 crisis, whether they also touched upon, or we will discuss this topic. Okay, let's get started with the first topic. As Professor Lee said, the health crisis and disaster management framework were published. And at the international level, we have to work together to mitigate the risk of disaster. It's actually the global declaration. And to make the globe resilient, many of us have been working so hard with this principle, including NGOs. But when we are exposed to this kind of crisis of infectious diseases, we still go through such sufferings and challenges. For example, like 35,000 were newly confirmed in Korea. And then we may question ourselves if this system, our system, works properly. And except for Korea, other countries actually block their border to prevent foreigners from coming into their countries. But Korea has made our own way. So we also have to think about this. In this crisis, the international declaration, like the Sendai framework, and also action plans, global action plans, should play a part. And did it really work? You may answer the question, and if you think the answer is yes, then you have to give an explanation or rationale. If no, then the same applies. Well,
thank you very much. Annyeonghaseyo, namaste, and konbanwa, and greetings from Tokyo. Thank you very much for this very interesting panel discussion. to my personal opinion, I will say that yes, we had all these global frameworks like Sendai or HEDRM, Health Emergency Disaster Risk Management of WHO. And we had also, as you heard from Sanjay, that there are the local frameworks, the addendum, health addendum, and so on. But on reality, I will say that very few countries have actually used this framework to respond. And one of the main reasons is most of the countries, they have responded this pandemic based on their earlier experiences on the earlier pandemics, whether it is SARS or MERS or H1N1 and so on. For example, in case of Japan, Japan's main response was the Infectious Disease Control Act, which was enacted in 2013. And that was based on the pandemic, the last pandemic. And then the local governments in Tokyo or in other prefectures, they have also their own response plan based on that one, but not on the Sendai framework. So I see that there is a real gap here between the Sendai framework and the health-related response framework, which most of the countries have actually used. I think I will say possibly one example where I was born in India. India is possibly one of the only countries, so far I know, in Asia, which used its disaster management framework to respond to this particular pandemic. And within disaster management framework, there were the natural hazards and the biological hazards. So India used that biological hazards part to actually make different types of response plan at the national level and also in the local level. Because it's very, very important to link it to the disaster management, because pandemic is not just a health hazard. When we have this prolonged lockdown, there are many, many different complex issues, whether it is livelihood, whether it is education, whether it is supply chain management or logistics and so on. So we really need a very strong disaster risk reduction framework to be backed. Currently, my role as the Science Technology Advisory Group chair of the UNDRR, we are working very closely now to develop some sort of basic guideline that how, with this pandemic response, how we can bring this lesson and link it to different parts of the Sendai framework on those 4 priority areas, so that it actually helps the national government and then the local government to make the proper response. So I will stop here for the time being. Thank you.
사무관님 나가 계시니까 직접 이런 진행하고 계십니다.
Mr. Kim Seung-dae, the officer, can you please...
발표 제가 의견을 드리는 시간이 조금 길어질 것 같은데 좀 양해해 주시길 부탁을 드리겠고요. 앞서 토론에서도 얘기가 나오고 해가지고 과연 이 샌다이 프레임워크가 과연 이게 작동을 하느냐 이런 부분들을 상당히 지금 문제 제기를 많이 해주셨고 이렇게 하셨는데 제가 UNDRR에 4년 조금 넘게 지금 근무를 하고 있거든요. 그래서 그런 차원에서 제가 저희들의 어떤 의견과 제 의견과 입장을 조금 말씀을 드리겠습니다. 먼저 샌다이 프레임워크는 유엔 총회에서 이제 채택된 거기 때문에 유엔 기구에서 이렇게 유엔 기구 차원에서 접근했다라고 보시면 될 것 같고요. 그리고 유엔 기구의 어떤 위상이라든지 그런 기구는 재난위험 경 그리고
status and also advantages were all applied with the concept of sustainable development, climate change, and so on and so forth. So United Nations is actually a sort of a controlling a sort of orchestra. And United Nations also has an ability of mobilizing and convening the sessions, conferences, and also giving some guidelines. So UNDRR's major role is to reduce the risks Sustainable Development Goals and Paris Agreement should be connected to the reduction of disaster risks. That's one of our focal areas that we have been working on. And capacity building, the real capacity building, requires tools, and we do have the tools. For example, scorecard, how we can make use of it, how we can implement it. We have been training people, and also we transfer technical support to those in need. Declaration is very specific. We have 7 specific goals under the framework, and to raise awareness and also improve understanding. We also have been sharing with the government's priorities of our agenda. Together with public servants across the world in work in the area, we have been training them. We have been training experts regarding tools and mechanisms and implementation actions. But for global platform, based on the platform, we have been altering Sendai framework to be used in every country. But the issue is this: although we are training those in relation to the area, the real responsibility to take measures and to act are actually under local governments and municipalities. We can do it, we can help you, but it should be implemented under your responsibility, under the responsibilities of municipalities. That's one thing. And 187 countries sent their public servants to us, and those public servants were trained. And in the training sessions, they are supposed to share their best practices and experiences, including donations, etc., with other countries. So far, the role of Sendai framework has been quite significant. It cannot be neglected. But see, 500,000 people died of COVID-19 today. Which registers a higher death toll than Sendai framework, which had 200,000 to 300,000 deaths. So that's something that we feel sorry about. And we went through SARS and MERS in the past. Nonetheless, the problems faced by the international communities and organizations that time and effort made by the government were not necessarily arranged and reported and shared across the world. It is also one thing that we had to do. Well, the lessons learned from such infectious diseases that should have been shared by stakeholders and each government. That's what I feel sorry about. Okay. UNICSDR was the former UNDRR, UN Disaster Risk Reduction, right? Well, this organization is so much relevant to the issue that we are talking about at the moment. We have the Ministry of Administration in Korea is also has also sent an official to them, and he is working for UNDRR on behalf of the Ministry of Administration. But anyways, okay, we never know when he comes back to Korea. But anyways, so now let's move to the topic 2. Well, So let's move to the topic 2.
The second question is something that everyone will talk a lot in common. We had a health crisis due to COVID-19, the collapse of a medical system, and this crisis doesn't stay in one sector. However, it has affected other sectors. In the past, even though people were not satisfied, from my personal perspective, South Korea dealt with single digester well. For instance, Japan, when they had a Fukushima digester, the facilities were damaged, and that led to the radio contamination through the sea and land, and that has ultimately contaminated crops and seafood, and So COVID-19 is something that is global. So it's hard to see this COVID-19 as a single disaster, but it is multi-angle disaster. So it is important to have a complex approach towards this situation. If you fail to do so, it will be challenging for organizations like a Red Cross to get the donations they want. So this is something that we shouldn't look at from a fragmental perspective, but with a complex, the multi-sectoral approach is vital to tackle this situation. I know it's easier said than done, but it is very important to take actions towards it. So in the field, are there anything that we have learned in the field, or something that we will have to consider in the future? We have experienced many phases with COVID-19. For those who are directly working in the field, I think COVID-19 was an eye-opening opportunity for them. When I learned back in 1980s, there was an emphasis on the importance of disaster is something that should have been prevented to protect human beings. However, disaster is somewhat related to public health. But it was an awakening moment, occasions that COVID-19 is public health related. So in South Korea, there are 3 incidents that changed the paradigm. The first one is the Sampung department store collapse. And the second one is when we had the new the structure came in the fire station, and the third one is COVID-19. The issue lie on COVID-19 is I know it's hard to change the approach and the methods, especially from experts. Those non-professional, non-experts, there is a tendency that they neglect these. Even if they might have lies, there is no way that you can identify whether those are lies or not. What we have been neglecting is, you'll be able to know when you look at the presence, the field. If you go into the field, when I say field means everywhere. Your home, your workplace, everywhere. When we used to refer, say, a fire station, that's very small a friction of the field. We've been complimented about the way we dealt with the coronavirus, COVID-19 situations, however. But there are a lot of voices coming from the field. If I share the voices that I heard from the field, there's nothing greater than the selfishness from individual level. This can be explained when you look at those countries who closed, locked their borderlines. Also, when you go to the field, we saw this during the MERS. There was no guideline. When MERS occurred, there was a guideline. And also with the COVID-19, there is a guide coming down. This hasn't changed much since MERS. The only thing that has changed now is we sort of conceal that, not open it up. But at the moment with the COVID-19, we open up, we disclose this information twice a day, which is the difference compared to MERS. And when we, in terms of the context, there isn't the visually clear improvement. But because we asked the public to follow the guides, we were able to gain trust from the public. But majority of the actions we have taken was all done spontaneously. I'm not saying that you have to follow the manual every single time, but when you're actually working in the field, it is impossible to follow the manual because you face occasions where you probably only have time to find the manual that you need to follow. So you have to play by ear. I mean, you have this manual as a reference, but yeah, this is a very clear aspect that South Korea has done better than Japan, which is South Korea has taken some of the actions spontaneously and immediately. One of the strengths that we have is the digitalizations, which was used to process the financial ads for those who need help, whereas Japan failed to do that due to the lack of digitalization. When you go to the field, things weren't just pretty. Things did look messy. In fact, so those who need to consider this, I would like to urge those people to have a holistic approach. So I would like to urge them to create that is resilient to a disaster or incident. In order to this, we need to change the way that we perceive. The one thing that Japan does better than us is when they make policy, regulations, law, they follow, but we don't. The last thing that I'd like to ask to the public is the civil mentality. When you look at Sendai framework, it comes from top to bottom, but it is much more important that the actions coming from the bottom to the top. So this forum is being broadcast online worldwide, and I hope that everyone got the message that we're trying to convey. So if you take this point into account, I will be much grateful. We talked about that we having a fragmental approach towards the disaster risk reduction management. And we've been talking about what actions need to be taken in the perspective of public health. Hello. Many speakers from session 1 and 2 talked about the importance of the inclusivity and the collective approach. So the common thing in Sendai framework and WHO framework is the collective approach. And these approaches need to be done at every level. I'd like to share a story of mine. Back in 2009, there was a warning about the pandemic by the new bird flu. While we were working on that project, H1N1 actually took place. So without knowing what type of virus, what type of pandemic we will have, we concluded that we will need a holistic approach. But when H1N1 virus came out, even though we did have agreement that we will have a holistic approach and action, but we weren't able to carry out that, which really disappoints me because I am being infectious diseases specialist. It was disappointing because we failed to do what we have agreed previously when the real situation actually took place.
Well, out of the basic instincts, there are two instincts like a fear instinct and suspension instinct. So we have such instincts. So we have to accept our instincts and based on, accepting that instinct, so we have to make a plan and implement those plans all together. And as the official coming from UNDRR said, to recover from disasters and also prevent the disasters, each government and countries have been conducting some trainings and educations. I, as a person working for this area, would like to tell you about this. Of course, the plans and preparedness are important, and continuous implementation is also important. Mr. Lee also mentioned that he was part of the X training, and such trainings are very important. Yes. And also, for additional things that we have to remember based on health DRR and also DLM and also the Sendai framework, national leadership is important. For health, actually WHO have held a global leadership, but we have seen some problems and issues coming from it. So we have to define it well and support them to exert their leadership well. And at the national level as well, as Professor Wang said, the local sites went through some challenges, and Mr. Peck at Global Care said that he saw some consistent and fast responses in local communities, sponsored and supported by the central government, with the Prime Minister coming down to Daegu. So holistically and as a whole, the response was quite good. That's what people think. What we have to do in our part should be kept in mind. That's important. And not only at the national level, but also at the local level, preparedness should be made. How to respond at the local community level should have been planned, and local residents also have to be trained. So World Vision and Red Cross, together with the residents in local communities, will share the information about how to respond to crisis. We have been training them already. And other series of trainings for disasters, not only this kind of thing, also should be provided, ranging from surveillance to early warning, which is a larger cycle. We have to take an integrated approaches. Well, someone said preparedness is maybe more important than responses. Considering that, yes, we have to be ready with a rigorous preparedness. Last but not least, communication is very vital. Infodemics. The word was emerged because misinformation spread among the public. But in Korea, through a one-day and daily communications, we were able to give a right information to the public. So thinking the communication is very important, we have to be prepared to make sure communication is going smooth without any confusion in the case of crisis. And what's also important is about working on site. You can find answers about the questions on site. Recently, we have been hearing about beneficiary communications. We have to make sure their voices are reflected in our policies and actions. And that's a systematic approach. Systemic approach and integrated approaches were mentioned by her. And on the side of a medical and health disasters, please, Professor Wang, give us your insight. Well, health and medical disaster is not completely different from regular and ordinary disasters. We have to just follow the principles. That means the health and medical workers have to have a higher understanding of disasters, and disaster experts also have to have a higher level of healthcare. Every citizen can have a high understanding of disasters and healthcare, but experts should improve their understanding. Attitude is the most important element. We have to make that effort on a daily basis, even before the crisis takes place. And at the same time, as someone said, in December, we did a training in preparation for crisis. And we talked to each other that there was actually the fortune. It was just a fortune. We're just so lucky, because that training was a training under the scenario of a virus coming from China. And in 2 months, COVID-19 outbreaks really happened. Well, but the developed countries will be much better in the future, I think, than us now, because they also now go through these crises. So we also have to keep working hard on this. And for the shortage of beds, it has been always raised, but that's about public sector hospitals. The private sector hospitals have enough beds, and that's the reason that we need collaboration between public and private sectors. And personal sanitation has been so much emphasized. But you see, these days we don't necessarily see many patients with other influenza, and that's because people have been so much cautious about their sanitation. And last question. As you know, the United Nations has been pursuing Sustainable Development Goals, but before that, the Millennium Development Goal was set targeting 2015. And so SDG started from 2015. The experiences felt by the world, COVID-19, can make impact to implementing the goal of SDG. Maybe Professor Rajib Cho can make some comments. What kind of impact and contributions can be made to
so many small business owners and the medium-sized business were affected reversely by the situation. Because there has been reduced traffic in the air and online, 12% of the carbon CO2 was reduced. But we have other SDGs, Sustainable Development Goals, by 2030. There's a lot of issues at the moment at present, the racism issues in the States and peace issues. So it will be a great opportunity for us to review all these the current issues, having COVID-19 in the center. I think pretty much everything has been touched upon. But from the perspective of World Vision, we have carry out some research in the field. The earnings of the public has reduced by half. Even though we wanted to have a positive circulation with this crisis, but when we see these reduced incomes, I can sense that the negative circulation is already cycle is already started. And how long it will take to recover from this current crisis? 1 or 2 years, maybe 5 years. The only advantage or the only benefit is, as my co-presenter, the panelist mentioned, is the reduced carbon CO2. So to this extent, the green recovery is a good topic. And another issue we have experienced is education, which will ultimately have impact on the future of the teens and children. So how are we going to adapt these current situations associated with education is one of the SDGs that we are taking very seriously at the moment. Yeah, shall we move on to the next question? So the next question is, how does and will the COVID-19 pandemic affect the SDGs? And then what directions should we pursue in terms of public health, and any comments related to that? So it will be very important to build a safe environment. Having local governments and communities and all these experts involved. If you're able to just briefly give your answers, that'd be great. What the central government and the local governments should be focusing on is there was no the assumptions that there will be a infectious disease. Now is the time to consider any types of disaster. For example, there will be a storm or earthquake. You have to evacuate people. But with the same situation, if those people are exposed to the risk of being infected by a virus, we do have a response structure in place to deal with these natural disasters such as earthquake and storm. However, within that situation, that if someone catch coronavirus, then we will have to have multiple angles to consider the situation and tackle the issue accordingly.
For the disruptions, I think these are becoming new normal for this type of teleconference and broadcasting. I will possibly quickly address these 2 points. One on the SDG, I heard when I was back, there was a little bit of interruption, but when I was back, I heard our colleagues actually touched upon some important point of this SDG. And from my perspective, I think, yes, globally, the countries are differentially affected on SDG. It's possibly too early to make an estimate, but many UN organizations, they are now trying to project what are the numbers and all those type of things. So definitely, yes, the SDGs are definitely impacted, but then some are impacted positive way, but some are impacted negative way. Very straightforward, like SDG 1, which is like the poverty, and people say that there is an estimate very recently published by World Bank that the poor people who lives in $1 to $1.5 per day, that percentage will increase from 8.2 to close to almost 9% globally. That means that it is almost a 20 to 30 million people increase. So definitely there will be an impact on the poverty. Many people lost their livelihoods. And of course, it will impact the hunger. So food security is a major problem. The agriculture product, it is also, there is an FAO made an estimate that 9% of our direct impact on the farmers, which will be affected, and that will impact on the SDG number 2. Health, well-being, we all know. But one very interesting point here that now we are all focusing on pandemic, but that is actually affecting very strongly the basic healthcare facilities in many countries. Like Korea, Japan are possibly the exceptions, but there are many countries, many poor countries who possibly don't have the basic healthcare facility, and they are now diverting everything on the pandemic response. So this basic healthcare part, which is the SDG 3, that has been very strongly affected. And of course, the education SDG 4, again, like 1.2 billion people, they are our colleagues from World Vision, possibly she knows it much better than anybody else, that the impact of this interruption of the education, we lost 3 to 4 months of this whole education. Yes, again, for the developed country, for many countries, we talk about the online conversion of the education, but many African countries, many Asian countries, the rural community, where education is a major problem, there is no digital connectivity, so online education is really not feasible. So there are all these negative sides. But I would like to just highlight one part, that there are also some positive impact on the SDGs, because many countries on this during pandemic, they have invested quite a bit of like what they call the economic boosting. So like say, for example, German government has invested 22% of their whole national GDP. Japan has invested $1.1 trillion US, which is again close to 20%. There are many, even the developing countries are also investing. The important thing is that how these new investments are actually linked to those gap areas in the SDG. So I think that will actually define quite strongly that whether we are really achieving the SDGs by 2030 or not. But I'm sure that there will be a time lag. Possibly we will also be thinking maybe there will be some discussions when this pandemic is settled down to maybe extend the time period from 2030 to maybe another 1 year or 2 years. I don't know, but there might be a possibility for that. So that's on the SDG part. Then another part is like how the DRR and the community resilience part, and especially in the field of community resilience. Our colleagues who had experience from UNDRR has very rightly pointed out the complex emergency. Like my own city, I was born in a city called Kolkata in eastern part of India. That city had, of course, the pandemic, but in May, there was a major cyclone, the typhoon, actually hit this particular city, and the city had no water. Even my house back in Kolkata also had no electricity, no water for almost 1 week. So when we have this type of disaster within the pandemic period, so then there was a major problem, like how you evacuate people. Like we always talk about the distancing, physical distancing, social distancing, but when you actually evacuate them to the cyclone shelter, it's very difficult to possibly maintain all those type of physical distancing. Korea, Japan, we are entering into the typhoon season. So we will see that how this type of complex disasters actually come in. But I would like to point out maybe 3 things on this community perspective. One is the risk perception is absolutely very, very important. And risk perception is based on the right information, right risk information at the right time. This is very, very relevant for the invisible disaster, and that's how the trust on the information, the legitimacy from where the information comes. Our colleagues also talks about infodemic issue and the fake news and all these things, and how Korean example is possibly one of the great example that how to reduce this type of fake news. So I think the legitimacy of the information. So that's point number 2. And the point number 3 is like, I always say about this 3 help we call about self-help, protect myself, mutual help, protect your community, and public help, which is with the government. So self-help, mutual help, public help, these are 3 core things. But what is also emerging is a network help, because how we are all interconnected now, and something happening somewhere else is affecting me. So this network help is also becoming very important, which will actually strengthen this core community resilience, which is based on self-help, mutual help, public help. Thank you very much.
문제를 내주셔서 대단히 감사합니다. 다음에 순서 끊어져 가지고.
We will have to make a road, and we will have to make a new journey. As Professor Rajib said, the policymakers and politicians and the governments have to set up a system. And at the age of new normal, we have to make a system in the new world. And we will see some vulnerabilities, and we have to make sure that we will have a proper access to policies and initiatives. And that's the role of policymakers, I believe, and everything is connected. COVID-19 is a public health crisis, but it actually affects every aspect of society. So we have to think about cross-sectoral synergy effect. It's not just confined to one specific sector, as we have been discussing and talking with Professor Lee during the break time. There's nothing alone. We all have to go together. This is a new situation. How we have to be responsive to this is the biggest challenge that we have to meet. We know what we have to do at this moment for now, but we alone can do it really well. But collaboration and cooperation with different sectors and different experts may be a little difficult for us. So we have to improve it. And third, the K quarantine system should improve further, although we have been quite successful so far. As Mr. Choi said, a digital transformation will be accelerated. That will be the journey that we have to take in the future. Once everything is based on digital, then we will find new vulnerabilities, new loopholes. So anyways, at the end of the day, we find out we'll meet in person sometimes. So we have to take into account the vulnerabilities of digital tools and mechanisms. Not only the governments, but also every staff should be a stakeholder to discuss this issue. Yes. Well, now we are moving to the fourth sub-session, which will be the free debate. But in the best interest of time, maybe we have to speed up. So we're going to take just... Well, the budget for 2020 is over 6 trillion won, to my understanding. So when the average tax amount per person is 100 million won, to my understanding. So they have their own expectations based on their tax amount, right? Well, different countries has different welfare systems and benefits. Well, at the moment, we may endure the budget shortage, but in case that we will experience the second wave of virus, then can you really be standing the situation? So, well, everybody has their own standard of welfare and benefits, but at this moment the economic impact is also huge. So we have to make sure the budget issues will be solved properly. Yes, agree. Well, he spoke of something in relation to his role and expertise, I think. Any other comments or questions? Is there anyone who should speak something, and without speaking and talking, then you cannot sleep tonight? Is there anyone who feels that way while going through this pandemic? Donor countries and receiving countries in the past were divided, but going through this pandemic, we realized that everyone was affected. So in the future, we have to prepare ourselves for the future, and we have to improve our resilience. As a presenter said, business continuity management should be improvement, and the model should be set up. For example, when we are on board in the airplane, we have to you listen to the manual of in case of crisis. For example, you have to make sure that you put the oxygen mask on yourself first and help others, right? So it's like that. In this kind of crisis, we also make sure we have to be resilient on our own and then help other countries. So we have to be prepared for that. relation to COVID-19 and disasters, I would like to throw some questions which cannot be really answered at the moment. That will be my last intervention. For now, let me throw a few questions. Will coronavirus make a positive impact on environment? Yes. No one can answer the question. How about Himalayan mountains? Now the Himalayan mountain is seen in India, and dolphin is playing in Venice. That's good for environment, but as people are all stuck at home, all the garbages and waste are overflowing at home. That's negative for the environment, right? So we cannot really have a biased perspective. How about the COVID-19 is discriminative from the president of a country to homeless people. Anyone can be the subject to COVID-19, but still the vulnerable group of people are more vulnerable to coronavirus. So can you really say that COVID-19 is equal to everyone? And how about contact? Well, the contactless is actually proper English. Contact is Korean English, I would say. Anyways, such a contactless culture will spread, but then will it be the trend, the major trend? Well, there should be some people who have to contact to survive, right? There are some businesses like that. For example, e-commerce. So e-commerce facilitates delivery services, and that could be, a trend. That's what people think. But as we've seen in Coupang's case, what if the delivery man is impacted? Well, these are just several questions, and such questions will come up constantly. If we are not prepared for these questions, another crisis will be brought up to our society. So let me wrap up the session now, briefly. Yes, we are heading toward new normal, and disaster management is very needed together with disaster preparedness and recovery and response. And recovery and response are short-term strategy, and preparedness is a sort of a long-term strategy, right? And we have taken into account some very important elements in response, recovery, and preparedness. As our presenter said, a local community has to play a very critical role in responding to the crisis. Local resilience is very important, and education and plans are very important too. This concludes our session. Thank you all panelists and for being with us, and my special thanks should go to those panels and presenters coming from overseas countries. Thank you so much. Well, let me pass over the microphone to the head of the center. Thank you very much for this meaningful panel discussions. If we have more time, then maybe we can discuss more productive talks. Thank you.